Dead America. Tales of the First Month. The Campers. Part 3. Chapter 1. David stood back as Carver held up the key fob at the windows, clicking the lock button to see if any of the cars reacted in the lot. On the far left, a bright red sedan blinked. "It'll be a tight fit, but it's something," the older man said, and stepped back from the zombie-infested window. David pursed his lips as Millie squeezed his hand again. He gave her a squeeze back for good measure. She hadn't been doing so well since Chet, and he didn't know what to do for her other than just make her feel like he and Alex were safe and accounted for. That seemed to keep her calm. More and more migrated over from Sports World. They needed a plan. "We don't have any more guns kicking around to make a big fuss, do we?" Kyle asked, running his hands through his copper hair. Carver shook his head. "I wouldn't be fighting with a cane if that were the case." "Can we just sneak out the back and circle around?" Millie asked, standing on her tiptoes to see how many zombies were near the red car. "By the time we did that, it would probably be overrun," Kyle replied. David nodded. He looked up to his mom's best friend. The guy had been there for her through thick and thin, as long as he could remember. He'd been almost like a father to him and Alex. He'd never understood why they hadn't just gotten married, or at least gotten together. Why she wanted dudes like Chet, who in the end hadn't been all that bad, rest his soul. When she had a guy like Kyle in her life, David would never understand. "Wait, they usually have a big community barbecue here in the fall," Kyle said. "Where would they keep the barbecues?" Carver shrugged. "The storage units, I'd guess." "Why?" "Propane," David piped up, catching Kyle's drift. The red-haired man ruffled the teenager's hair, giving him a wink. "Bingo, my man," he said. "Wait, you's wanting to blow up propane tanks as a distraction?" Carver raised an eyebrow. "We could end up destroying the building." Kyle shrugged. "Does it matter? The zombies are going to get in eventually anyway. If we time it right, we could even blow it up with some of them inside, and then get to the car. If we time it right." Millie chewed her bottom lip with worry. David resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "It was a good plan. We need to hurry," he urged. "Those shelves aren't going to hold forever. Come on." Carver waved for them to follow him. "We're not blowing up the building," Millie said, digging in her heels. David motioned for the others to just go, and he took his mother by the shoulders. "Mom." He looked her straight in the eyes. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too, and I'm sorry about Chet." Her eyes swelled with tears, and he couldn't help feeling like a piece of shit for bringing it up. But it had to be done. "I'm sorry he died," he continued. "And I'm sorry I was such a dick to him. I bet Alex is sorry too. We should have been more accepting. We just wanted to protect you. And I know right now you're trying really hard to protect us. But right now, protecting us is going to mean taking a risk to get to that car. We can't keep trying to outrun these things on foot. We get tired, but they don't." Millie reached up and cupped her son's face. "You're so smart," she said, voice cracking. "I am, because you raised me that way," he replied, offering her a reassuring smile. "Now let me help get us out of here. Come on. We have to be strong for Alex." She took a deep breath and nodded. "It's a good thing you're stronger than me," she admitted, voice firmer as she cleared her throat. "Thank you for reminding me what's important." He took her hand again and began to lead them down the hallway. "Anytime, Mom." They caught up with the others, who had found the storeroom and were pulling things out into the main corridor. "Found some gardening tools," Alex called from inside and started tossing sharp objects out onto the tiles. David knelt down and picked up 2 long-handled tillers and handed one to his mom. He definitely felt better with a weapon in his hand, and he hoped that Millie would, too. She gripped hers tightly and then leaned on it, peeking into the dim storage area. "Any barbecues?" she asked. Carver hooted from the corner opposite Alex. "Oh, hells yes," he exclaimed. "There's 7 of the fuckers with extra propane tanks, too." He rolled one out to the door, and Kyle took it from him, setting it aside. "The kitchen opens up on the opposite side of the building to the parking lot," he said. "Right? That would probably be the logical place to ignite them." "How are we gonna do that, Dad?" Rachel asked, eyes wide with curiosity. David couldn't help but chuckle, and she blushed as she tried to avoid looking at him. He'd noticed over their 2 weeks in the wild that she was kind of a pyro, always playing with the fire and trying to burn this and that. He wasn't surprised that she was excited to blow up a bunch of propane. He pulled a lighter from his pocket and wiggled it in front of her, by setting stuff on fire, of course. He took off the button-down shirt he wore over the tank top beneath and tossed it casually over her shoulder. This should work just fine. David nodded. If they opened one of the propane tanks in the kitchen full of tanks and used the shirt as a wick under the door, then they'd have enough time to book it to an exit somewhere safe before the whole thing went up. "Good plan," he said, and he and Kyle fist-bumped before Carver emerged with another tank. "These fuckers ain't gonna move themselves," the older man said, and the others hurried to help him transport the rest. Chapter 2. Kyle hauled the last tank in next to Carver and stacked it up on the counter with the rest. They admired their handiwork, and then he tossed the lighter to Rachel. She caught it, wide-eyed, and he inclined his head to the shirt on her shoulder. "Twist that up and tie knots in it so that it's like a wick," he instructed, and waited for her to do so. Turning to Carver, "Do we know where our exit is?" The caretaker nodded. "East side of the building. There's a fire door. We'll wait there and watch to see which way the zombies go after the explosion." "And we'll be safe there from the explosion?" Millie asked. "Safe as we can be, with the cement walls," Carver replied with a shrug. She chewed her bottom lip, but stayed quiet, and Kyle shot David a glance. Whatever the kid had said to her had definitely mellowed her out since Chet, and for that he was thankful. He needed her to be clear-headed for this. "Okay, done," Rachel said proudly, holding up the knotted shirt. Kyle motioned to the door. "All right, everyone get on the other side of the door and Rachel. You slip the shirt underneath it, about halfway through. I'll open up a few tanks and then book it to you guys." We light the shirt and then make a run for the fire door. Carver gave a little salute, resting the long-handled hoe on his shoulder that he'd replaced his cane with. He strolled out of the kitchen like it was a normal day at the office. Kyle envied his absolute relaxation in the face of the apocalypse. He waited for everyone to be safely in the hallway, ready to run, and watched Rachel wedge the shirt beneath the door. He turned and opened 2 tanks at once, then a third just for good measure, and then ran for it. They needed as much time as they could buy. As soon as he shut the door behind him, Rachel was already lighting the shirt, making sure that it smoldered well before jumping to her feet. Carver led the group thundering down the hallway, and they turned left to cluster at the east side of the building next to the fire door. The older man gently pushed the bar down, inching the door open ever so slightly so he could see what was going on outside. He closed it with an equally careful, soft click. "There's a ton of them things out there," he said. "Hopefully they'll get the hell out of Dodge once the kitchen blows." They waited. Nothing happened. "Dad," Rachel whispered, "how long should it take?" Kyle wasn't 100% sure, but he didn't think it should have taken this long. He took a deep breath, but before he could open his mouth, a clatter echoed through the halls. "The shelves," David cried, and Kyle gripped the shovel that he'd liberated from the storeroom. He'd given the letter opener to Rachel for an emergency, as he'd been more comfortable with a long-handled weapon to keep the creatures as far away from him as possible. Why wasn't the kitchen blowing? Kyle tightened his grip and nodded to Carver as moans and groans floated through the halls towards them. "Keep an eye out," he said. "I'm gonna peek at the kitchen door." "No, you're not," Millie hissed. Kyle shook his head, already backing away before she could grab for him. "Stay quiet, stay safe. Don't worry," he assured her, and then hurried down the hall. There was a muffled cry, and he glanced over his shoulder to see David holding her back, his hand over her mouth, as Alex jogged to catch up with him. "What are you doing?" Kyle whispered, giving him a little push back towards his mother. The kid scowled at him. "Nobody goes anywhere alone, remember?" he whispered back, holding up his own shovel. Kyle shook his head. There was no time to argue. He reached the corner and peered around it to the right, and sure enough, the shirt was still flickering in the distance. It was just taking forever to burn. To the left were zombies. Just a hallway full of them, shoulder to shoulder, grunting and clawing the walls as they looked for food. Kyle immediately pushed Alex back, with the intention of them both making a hasty retreat. But of course, the kitchen took that opportune moment to blow. It was as if time slowed down. The building shook violently, and everything went white. Kyle coughed and felt around him, scrambling for Alex, hoping the kid hadn't been crushed by anything. He couldn't find him. In the distance, he heard Millie's muffled screams, but it was too dusty to see. He was afraid to call out to her for fear of drawing zombie attention, so simply continued to feel around blindly for the boy. After what felt like forever, his hand finally gripped a denim-clad leg, and his heart soared. He quickly patted up the body and then cried out as his hand exploded in pain. The dust cleared just enough for him to watch his fingers disappear into a zombie's mouth. Chapter 3. David's arms gave out as he watched the ceiling cave in on his brother and Kyle. It almost happened in slow motion. Millie leapt forward, but Carver caught her, slamming her back against the wall as the building shook with the explosion. Rachel collapsed to the tile, slack-jawed with shock as her father disappeared behind rubble and dust. She raised her hands to her face, shaking fingers against her cheeks as the quartet stared in disbelief at the wall of busted building where the corridor had been. "Get your shit together," Carver grunted as he held Millie at bay, pressing his arm against her mouth. "I need to look outside, and you need to be quiet." "Get my shit together," she cried, voice muffled by his sleeve. "My son is under there." "He's gone," Carver replied firmly. "They're gone." No, Rachel babbled, rocking back and forth, and David suddenly snapped back into reality, the shock pulsing in the back of his head. His mom was hysterical. Rachel was borderline catatonic. Carver needed his help if they were going to get out of this alive. Alive. Kyle and Alex wouldn't be getting out of this alive. David shook his head, taking a deep breath. He reached down and grabbed Rachel's arm, pulling her to a standing position and gently leading her next to Millie. Carver raised an eyebrow at him and then reluctantly let go of the woman, creeping over to the fire door. "Mom, remember what I said earlier," David said gently. "About being strong for Alex," she said hoarsely, her voice sounding desolate and lost. "I was supposed to be strong for Alex." David gripped her shoulder tightly, inclining his head to Rachel. "Now you have to be strong for us. For me and Rachel." Millie turned to the red-haired girl as if seeing her for the very first time. She folded her surrogate daughter against her chest, the two of them clutching each other in silence. Carver finally took his moment to peek outside and wave David forward. "We're clear, but I don't know for how long," he said quietly. "Think they'll be okay to run." "They're upset, not useless," the teenage boy spat, but he couldn't blame the older man for wondering. Carver shrugged. "All right," he replied and turned to the women. "Ready to run, ladies." Millie clenched her jaw and nodded jerkily. Rachel turned her head back towards the pile of rubble and then took a deep breath, pulling away from the older woman. "Give me the keys," Millie demanded, holding out her hand. Carver raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I'm driving," she said, and he reluctantly put the keys in her hand. "I'm only giving you these on account I don't have license," he informed her. David opened his mouth to ask why, and then realized that this wasn't the time. And he didn't much care. He reached out and took Rachel's hand. "Stay close," he said, and she nodded, her cheeks suddenly pink. Carver counted down from 3 and threw open the door. Millie led the group sprinting across the asphalt, straggler zombies turning to grab at the speeding humans, but missing. As they got around to the main lot, they saw the swarming horde still pouring into the building, now a lot more accessible since the thing exploded. David focused on the car, on his mom, on getting there. He hoped it would start. He hoped it'd gas. He hoped they would make it. 6 had become 7, had become 6, had become 4. He pumped his legs as fast and hard as he could, pulling Rachel along beside him. Millie used the fob to unlock the doors, and the four of them reached the car at the same time. She dove into the driver's seat, Carver into the passenger, and David threw open the back door and shoved Rachel in before leaping in himself. The gardening tools clanked around, nearly spearing their wielders in the small space as they slammed the doors shut. A group of 6 zombies smacked into the side of the vehicle as they shut, and Millie started the car quickly. She revved the engine and then floored the accelerator, peeling out and running over 2 corpses before throwing the car into reverse and driving back over them. If we want this car to last us for our escape, you're gonna need to not run over shit. Carver yelled as he grasped the door, struggling to put on his seatbelt as Millie drove wild. Yeah, she replied flippantly as she tore across the lot, speeding behind the building and skidding to a stop at the kitchen. The whole back of the building had blown right out. She blinked rapidly at the mess, burning zombies staggering around in the heat, flames engulfing their rotted heads. "Let's go," Carver urged, but David knew what she was doing. She was saying goodbye. Rachel pressed a hand against the window and seemed to be doing the same thing. Millie finally hit the gas again, tires squealing as she sped away from the burning community center and headed north. Chapter 4. Millie drove like she'd never driven in her life. She sped up the mountain roads towards cabin country, taking corners too fast. "Mom!" David's cry finally got through to her, and she slowed down as she narrowly missed an overturned van. "How far should we go?" she asked, glancing over at Carver. He shrugged. "As far as we can get, I'm guessing. See if there's anyone else bunkered down up here." "What is that?" David asked, leaning forward so that his head was nearly in the front seat, and Rachel joined him, mouth hanging open. Millie finally slowed right down, staring up the winding road to what looked like a writhing cabin. But it wasn't writhing. The place was covered with zombies. "They're coming down the road." Rachel pointed to the staggering dead. They were all wearing khaki shorts and wide-brimmed hats, the kinds of hiker tourists that would come up here on buses looking like clones of each other. Millie watched with horror as they poured out of the trees. Where were they coming from? Why were there so many? The population of Gatlinburg was under 5,000. Where the hell were all these tourists coming from? She threw the car into reverse and turned around, speeding back down towards town. "Where are you going?" Carver demanded. She shook her head. "You were the one that didn't want me running them over," she said, a note of mocking in her voice. "So I have to go the other way." "But to where?" Carver replied, sounding annoyed. Millie didn't really know where. She was just driving. "Does it matter? Nowhere is safe. You said it yourself." "I don't like this line of thinking," he said warily. She shrugged. "You can tuck and roll then." She was tired of the guy, tired of everything. She'd tried so hard to make their vacation a good one. She'd brought everyone's favorite snacks, organized the best bonding time, made sure they had a little library in the van of everyone's favorite books. And her kids had been dicks to her boyfriend, and now her boyfriend and one of her kids was dead. Because, oh right, the apocalypse happened while they were gone. Zombies ate her family. "Mom?" David asked, and she waved him off. She had to be strong for him and Rachel. She could be strong. "No, we don't want to be on the highway," Carver said, a note of panic in his voice. "Turn around." "There's no point in turning around," Millie shot back. Carver shook his head. "There's a good point. The point being we don't want to go downtown. You want to see tourists?" "Mom!" David cried, eyes wide in the rear view as the landscape gave way to Gatlinburg proper. The town was a disaster. Windows smashed, blood spatters everywhere, cars on fire. The town had not fared the apocalypse well. Millie stared into the distance, mind reeling a mile a minute as she drove. Nowhere was safe. The whole country, possibly the whole world, had gone to hell. Carver cried out something unintelligible and grabbed the wheel of the car. Millie jerked it away from him, but it was too late. They spun out. She hit the brakes and the sedan skidded to a stop. Soon, the only sound the heavy breathing of the four of them in the car. "We need to find somewhere safe," Carver said, voice firm, and threw open the passenger door. Millie blinked through the windshield. The whole road in front of them was packed with zombies. "Mom, come on," David urged, jumping out of the car and opening the driver's side door. Rachel stood behind him, eyes wild, and he grabbed his mother's arm and pulled her, staggering from the vehicle. Groans and moans filled the air all around them, and her stomach sank when she realized they were surrounded. Then something roiled inside of her, a bubbling anger, churning her guts like a volcano. She reached into the car and grabbed the long-handled tiller that her son had bestowed upon her, the weapon that would kill these things at long range. She screamed and ran at the horde, meeting them head-on with a gardening tool to the face. She was vaguely aware of screams behind her, but ignored them. All she wanted was retribution. A mother's wrath exploded from her, stabbing and smashing and hurling every ounce of her strength at the zombies that took her loved ones from her. Her shoulder suddenly exploded in white-hot pain, and she shook herself violently, dislodging the creature from her flesh. She elbowed one in the face and stabbed another through the jaw, blood splattering across her brow. "Die, fuckers!" she screeched, eyes wild with reckless abandon, and she skewered two zombies through the stomach like a kebab, swinging them back and forth into their brethren. Hands clawed at her body, rough nails tearing at fabric and flesh, and still she screamed and stabbed. Soon the sun was gone, blocked out by groping hands and gnashing teeth, and the weight on her body was too much to bear. She finally hit the ground, crushed beneath a pile of suffocating rot and writhing bloody limbs, and all she could think was that soon she'd be with her family again. Chapter 5. Carver knew as soon as the crazed mother got out of the car that she was a dead woman. He always had correct feelings about people's eyes, and Millie's belonged to someone ready to die. She'd just gone off the deep end. It was because of this that he was ready to make a grab for the young ones when she went running at the horde like a gladiator. Thankfully, they didn't struggle, merely staring in their shock, and he was able to get them down a side street and away from the main horde drawn by Millie's shrieking. Why did she do that? The words whooshed out of David's mouth as he let himself be dragged along by the older man. Why would she do that? Carver threw open a rickety wooden door and shoved the kids inside, slamming it behind them. "Some people can only handle so much, kid." He grunted as he dragged a shelf over and shoved it against the door. He was huffing by the time he was done. This was why he'd been happier hunkering down safely at Sports World. He was getting too old to be running around like this. Rachel gripped David's hand tightly. The two of them joined together with white knuckles. "Where are we? Where do we even go now?" she asked, voice shaking. Carver inclined his head to the stairwell behind her. "I used to live here. A few years back," he said. "That stairwell goes to the walkout apartments on the back side of this building. I don't know what kind of shape they're in, but it'll give us a chance to regroup." "Regroup?" David scoffed. "There's only 3 of us left." Carver sighed. "Look, kid, you's wantin' to live through this, or what? If you want to give up like your mama, be my guest. But I'd like to survive the day. Maybe even the night, if I'm being honest." The kid recoiled as if slapped, but didn't argue. Carver knew he'd been harsh, but sometimes tough love was necessary, and he wasn't being dishonest. If the kid was going to be a liability to survival, then he was on his own. The old man didn't have time to wait on people that didn't want to live. He pushed past them and headed up the stairs, happy that the kids were following. "Where do you think we can go?" Rachel asked, voice small. Carver shook his head. "I'd have thought going north would be easiest. But now we know there are a shit ton of dead tourists up there," he replied with a sigh. "I think our best bet might be to try to get out on the south end, head back up into the mountains where yous were camping." "Makes sense," David replied hoarsely. There was clearly not as much danger out there if we didn't even know the apocalypse was happening. "We just need some supplies," Carver said as they reached the landing. It was a long hallway with apartment doors on the left side. Each of them, he knew, had sliding door walkouts to the street. If we can find enough stuff in these apartments to get us through for a bit until we can get far enough out in the wilderness, then we can scavenge and hunt for food in the woods. Like animals. Rachel raised an eyebrow. How are we gonna hunt for animals without weapons? Carver shrugged. Ain't you ever watched videos online? We'll figure out some rabbit traps or something. And there's lots of edible plants out there. There's also lots of poisonous ones, David muttered. But the old man ignored him. First things first, we need supplies, Carver said, holding up the hoe he still carried. He banged it on the first door and then pressed his ear up against it to listen for any movement. After a few moments, he opened the door, entering with his weapon held out in front of him. David and Rachel entered behind him, the former holding up his tiller and the latter gripping her dad's letter opener in her small fist. Carver didn't know how well they would actually do in a fight, but he had to trust them to have his back. These two kids were all he had now, and he was all they had. Poor fucking kids, he thought to himself. The apartment was clear, and they rummaged around in the kitchen and the bedroom, coming out with a backpack and a few boxes of crackers and a can of mushroom soup. They'd also found a box of matches and a bottle of aspirin, which Carver immediately took too dry to ease the knot beginning to ache in his back. There was shuffling in the next apartment, and the trio took up a triangle defense position in the hallway before Carver turned the knob and kicked the door in. A short woman zombie tore out towards them, skewering her chest right into David's tiller, her arms flailing everywhere to try to grab for a fresh meal. Carver smashed it a few times with the hoe, unable to break through the skull with the dull end, and Rachel leapt forward, stabbing it in the back of the head with her letter opener. She let go of it and brought her hands to her mouth, stepping back as the corpse slumped down. David wrenched the tiller free, hunks of flesh falling onto the carpet, and knelt to recover the letter opener. He stood and held it out to her. "Good job," he said gently, and offered a smile. She swallowed hard, reaching out to grip the small weapon in her fist. Carver led the way inside, clearing the place so they could do another search. By the time they were done with the row of apartments, each of them had a backpack stuffed with non-perishable food items and some household stuff that they thought would be useful. Carver also wrapped up a set of knives and a towel in case they needed to replace their weapons. "We're set," Rachel said as she hefted her bag over her shoulders. The older man shook his head. "Don't get too excited. We still have to get out of town," he replied, and pressed his lips into a thin line. But he couldn't help but feel a bit of hope himself. He hadn't expected to find much, but they were a lot more stocked than he'd thought they would be. Maybe things were starting to go their way. When he looked outside and saw a street devoid of the dead, his heart leapt even higher. "All right," he said, turning to the teens, who were back to holding on to each other. "We're gonna go out this door and then left. If it's clear, we're gonna go as far west as we can before turning south to get around the big horde back where the car is. We might have to improvise though, so stay as close to me as you can. And for shit's sake, stay quiet." The kids nodded somberly at him, faces pale but determined. Carver opened the sliding door as slowly as possible and then stuck his head out. He looked both ways and then stepped out onto the sidewalk, waving for them to follow. They hurried along the street as fast as they could, footfalls soft on the cement. The old man kept his eyes front, finally letting the hope soar in his chest at the sight of a quiet road ahead. Not a single movement. And then, as they passed the first side street, something slammed into his side. Chapter 6. It was as if time moved in slow motion. David was very aware of the air entering his lungs as he gasped, and Rachel's hands curling around his arm as she clutched at him in shock. The blur that slammed into Carver knocked him ass over tea kettle, and the teenager stabbed forward with his tiller on instinct. As the sharp tool plunged into the side of the zombie's crimson-stained shirt, the thing raised its face, matted blonde hair glued to its forehead. What should have been big blue eyes were now a milky white, and David was horrified to realize he was staring into the roomy dead eyes of a teenage girl, no older than him or Rachel. He let go of the tiller completely, staggering backwards as if struck, and Carver screamed something at him, but it was too late. A pack of at least a dozen zombies hurled themselves out of the side street onto the old man, and before he could scramble away, they buried him in gnashing teeth and clawing hands. Rachel jerked on David's arm, her shrieks finally cutting through the loud ringing in his ears, and the teenagers turned and tore back up the street, no clue at all of where they should go. He had the vague notion that maybe they should duck back inside the apartment they'd been in, but Rachel cut hard to the left as she spotted another group of zombies coming in the other direction. "Hurry!" she cried, pulling him along like a rag doll, jerking him up a set of stairs. He couldn't help but look back down at the street as they climbed the stone steps. Carver was completely gone now, lost in a sea of rotted flesh. The zombies swarming the street and tripping up the stairs, staggering over each other. At least the stairs seemed to slow them a bit. David suddenly realized where they were headed, and he tried to pull back on Rachel's arm. "We're headed up to the sky bridge," he huffed. But she didn't let up. "Rach, there's nowhere to go up there." "We can get down on the other side," she called back over her shoulder. "They won't be able to follow us there." David wasn't so sure of that, but it was really too late to backtrack. Though the corpses were slowed down a bit on the stairs, they were still climbing and blocking the way back down to the street. That was death, instant death. But was the way forward life, or just less instant death? He let Rachel lead him, his brain a muddled pile of mush. They were the only two living people left in downtown Gatlinburg. Two teenagers in a sea of zombies. They reached the bridge, and David's throat constricted. The weight of his family being gone weighed down on his shoulders like a sudden anvil, and his legs slowed. Rachel practically dragged him along behind her. But about halfway across, she stopped short. "No," she moaned, her head swiveling back and forth like a bobblehead. "No, just why?" she babbled. David finally had the wherewithal to realize what was going on. There were zombies ahead of them. And of course, there were zombies behind them. The way they'd come. He laughed. Rachel stared at him, eyes wide with shock. What else could he do? They were going to die here, on the sky bridge in Gatlinburg, from a zombie apocalypse. "Sorry," he gasped when he caught his breath and pressed his hands on either side of her tear-streaked face. "I'm so sorry, Rachel." He kissed her. And God, why hadn't he kissed her before? And tasted the salt of her tears as she sobbed against his lips. She clutched his arms and looked over the edge to the depths below. Her gaze hardened, and she pressed her mouth against his again, entwining her fingers through his. David caught her drift and faced the railing with her, holding her tightly. Just before the zombies sandwiched them, the two teenagers jumped. The two columns of zombies met each other on the bridge, confused at their lack of a fresh meal. The only thing drawing their attention was a soft crash from the trees below. This is the end of The Campers. I hope that you enjoyed the story and really appreciate you listening. Tune in next time for another tale from the first month.